You also take issue with Richard Dawkins' argument that God would have to be infinitely complex and therefore is highly unlikely.
Dawkins himself defines complex like this. He says a thing is complex if it has lots and lots of parts that are put together in a way that's unlikely just by chance. But of course, God isn't a being that's got parts. God is supposed to be a spirit. God doesn't have any parts. So it follows from Dawkins' own definition that God couldn't be complex. So I mean, it seems to me he's really sort of fallen off the boat at that point.
Richard Dawkins feels that he has stumbled across pretty much a knockdown argument against God's existence.
Mm-hmm.
He has a whole chapter, why God almost certainly doesn't exist, in
Yes.
which he basically says that any God able to create this complex universe must be infinitely more complex than the universe. Therefore, that begs the question, where did that complexity come from? So God itself doesn't explain anything. It just raises more questions. How do you respond to that? Because he obviously thinks it's the knockdown argument.
Yes, I think he thinks it's a knockdown argument because, frankly, he's philosophically naive. And it's a really silly argument, frankly, and it's not an argument that you're going to find discussed in philosophy journals. The classical view of God, of course, has always been that he's simple, the most simple thing that there is. And it seems to me there's no reason why to have something complex requires something more complex actually created. I don't really follow the logic of that argument, and certainly I don't know of anyone else apart from Richard Dawkins who actually runs this argument.
He claims that he's put it to theologians and philosophers and they've never been able to answer him. I mean, that's what he says in his book.
Yes, well, I can think of lots of philosophers who think it's complete nonsense.
One of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, feels that he's stumbled across an almost knockdown argument against God, which basically runs that any God capable of creating such a complex universe must be infinitely more complex. Therefore, saying there's a God explains absolutely nothing. How compelling do you find what he regards as a new, fresh knockdown argument?
Yeah, the argument comes from David Hume. It's an 18th century argument, quite well known to all philosophers, and has been refuted many times, in this sense, that of course, two main things to say about it. One is he holds as a sort of dogma that the more complex a thing is, the more improbable it is. So God, if God is complex, God is very improbable. That's false. You can't use probability. I don't want to get too technical about this, but assessing probabilities depends on some background against which you can assess them. You throw a die and there's 6 sides, so there's a 1 in 6 chance that one side will come up. That's probability. But if you don't know how many sides there are, and you don't even know if it's a die, you don't know whether there is a die or not, you can't assess probability. So you just can't use probability in a vacuum. So when he says the complex is more improbable than the simple, he's wrong. I mean, you just can't compare them, so you don't know. So that's the first point, right? It's not true that God is more improbable than the universe, even if God is very complex. Secondly, however, he simply doesn't read theology. Not surprising, he doesn't believe it exists. But that means he doesn't see what believers in God have always traditionally meant by saying God is simple. When a believer says God is simple, what we mean is, well, things in this world are complex. They're made up of bits. You stick the bits together and you get an object. Okay. God is not made up of bits. There are not bits of God that you stick together and get God. God is unitary, like a unitary consciousness, like your consciousness now. It's not made of little bits of consciousness stuck into one. It's essentially one, right, unified. And in that sense, God is a unified being, not complex. That's what a theologian means by saying God is not complex.
He chides you, in particular, in the God Delusion, for not knowing what it means to say something is simple.
Yes.
If you had a right of reply, what would you say?
I've written a reply, and which you won't read, I don't suppose. But, well, simplicity and complexity are difficult terms, and you have to spell out simple in what respect, with regard to what, and complex in what respect. God is complex in some ways. God is complex because God knows everything, and that's a lot of things to know, so you can see that's complex. But then there's only one consciousness, one mind, one knowledge of God, so that's simple compared to human beings who have lots of different things in their minds. So you have to spell out the meanings of simple and complex, and I have to say it is he who hasn't read the philosophical literature. There are lots of lovely articles in philosophy. One of them is called The Complexity of Simplicity. Reading that would be quite good.
Dawkins thinks that in the case of a divine designer of the universe, that is to say, if the designer is identified as God, then the designer is just as complex as the thing to be explained, so that no explanatory advance is made. Now, this objection raises all sorts of interesting questions about the role played by simplicity in assessing competing explanations. For example, there are many other factors besides simplicity that scientists weigh in determining which explanation is the best, such as explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, and so forth. An explanation which has broader explanatory scope may be less simple than a rival explanation, but still preferred because it explains more things. Simplicity is not the only or even the most important criterion for assessing theories. But again, leave those questions aside. Dawkins' more fundamental mistake lies in his assumption that God is just as complex an entity as the universe. That is plainly false. As a pure mind or consciousness without a body, God is a remarkably simple entity. A mind or a soul is not a physical object composed of parts. In contrast to the contingent and variegated universe, with all its inexplicable constants and quantities, a divine mind is startlingly simple. Dawkins protests, and I quote, "A God capable of constantly monitoring, controlling the individual status of every particle in the universe cannot be simple," end quote. This is just confused. Certainly, a mind may have complex ideas. It may be thinking, for example, of the infinitesimal calculus. But the mind itself is a remarkably simple, non-physical entity. Dawkins has evidently confused a mind's ideas, which may indeed be complex, with the mind itself, which is an incredibly simple entity, since it has no parts. Therefore, postulating a divine mind behind the universe most definitely does represent an advance in simplicity, for whatever that's worth.